Well, the sermon this morning is not from the usual lectionary. In fact, I got the sermon, as I say in here, from listening to a African-American church on the radio on my way home. So it is a bit unusual today. Usually I normally read this week's selections from the liturgy. And I began working up a message that is based on one of those 3 Bible verses. Well, today I've gone rogue. I just couldn't get revved up about any of the verses, so I went out and put my own series together. It's not totally my own doing. As I said, I heard a radio preacher touch on the same theme, that being, you got to know God to trust God. And to trust God means that you know that He will provide you with everything that you will need. Now, this was from a station that was featuring a true African-American Southern Baptist-style service, so I won't repeat the theme in the exact same manner, nor will I ask you to respond with the hallelujahs and the amen, brothers. But I must say, hearing the good news in that fashion sure does put a new slant on learning about God. My version will be a little more restrained, but hopefully the message will come through. The main theme of my sermon this morning is that you have to know God to trust God. And no one exemplifies that better than Abraham. To begin with, Abraham, as he was first called, was pretty much a common guy. He was a successful and fairly wealthy rancher, and he was faithful to God, as most of us here are. But he found favor with God, and God blessed his life. And God began by telling him to move out of Egypt, where his friends and his family were, from his home. But God said, "I've got another home for you." So based on simply that, Abraham packed up his family, including his wife Sarai, who will become Sarah for what it's worth, and he headed out to a place that God will identify, so he said. The story in Genesis doesn't say much about any questions that Abraham might have had. He simply says he picked up his stuff and he headed off. Now that was brave. But as it turned out, in trusting God, it paid off. Abraham found that the land God had promised was there. In fact, it only wasn't a patch of land, but the land also was a whole nation for Abram and through him as well. It pays to trust God because God will provide. Abram was renamed Abraham by God at that time, and Sarai was renamed Sarah, given their devotion and their faithfulness to God. They had done as God has asked, and they had lived the righteous life. Then God told Abraham and Sarah that they would have a son. Now, perhaps that wasn't such a big thing to hear about initially, but Abraham was nearing 100 years old and Sarah was only a few years younger. And that is a big thing. Abraham also had already sired a son with one of Sarah's maidservants a few years earlier, but to have a son with Sarah would mean that his lineage would be solid and the descendants would be truly from his wedding. You see, Abraham didn't question God's plan for them to have a child. He did deal with him a bit at that time, but Abraham trusted God and was telling him what God was telling him, and things turned out for the best. Again, trusting God was a good thing. Having that relationship with God makes trusting Him a whole lot easier. I'm sure that Abraham would have done some serious questioning as to whether or not God could do this as he had been promised. But Abraham was a righteous man, and he believed God and trusted Him. And their lives were about to become drastically different. They trusted God, and indeed it was better. Different, but better. God did provide as He promised. And then this final test, as the Bible put it, was given to Abraham in a message from God. He told Abraham to go out into the wilderness and sacrifice Isaac, his own son. God did not give them a reason, and we don't read about any pleading on behalf of Abraham or Sarah. We read in Genesis 22 that Abraham simply loaded up for that trip, bringing his son, a couple servants, a pack mule, and headed out. I like to believe that I trust God, but I am not sure if I have that much faith. Certainly not without being forced. One of my greatest fears is to lose a child. I remember once I lost track of my 2-year-old son at Disney World in Florida. He was being fussy as we were standing in line to watch a 3D movie, so I took him outside. And there were those jet fountains. I don't know if you've ever seen them, but they shoot a jet of water out of one pan and it arcs through the air without breaking up and lands into another pan somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 15 feet away. And I was so truly and so totally amazed that I forgot to keep track of Charlie, who wandered off and around the corner. And when I regained my wits and looked around, there was no sign of Charlie at all. My stomach contracted. How could he have gone? He could have gone in any direction, and luckily I found him after only a few minutes of searching. In my heart, I believe I trusted God at that time, but he wasn't foremost in my mind as I recall in my panic. I literally did not know which direction to run. Fortunately, God blessed us both, and I found him again, and God did provide. Now here in this story, Abraham knew what God had expected of him ahead of time, and that would make the loss even more difficult to bear. Plus, Abraham knew that it would take a couple of days to get to the place where the sacrifice will occur. We don't hear about the conversation between the father and the son. I can't imagine Abraham told Isaac the real reason for their journey. And when Isaac asked him about the sacrificial animal at the last moment, Abraham simply told him that God would provide. And here, Abraham trusted God. Would he have done the same if this was the first time he had talked with God? I doubt it. And without question, though, Abraham just headed out to do God's will, and that is trust. That is obedience. We hear that Abraham never hesitated. At the moment the sacrificial knife was about to fall, God called out and stopped it in midair, as the picture on the supplement shows. I'm sure Abraham was hoping that this would happen, but he was obedient to the point of being ready to go all the way. God had demanded a sacrifice, but as we've been saying, God will provide. Nearby in a thicket, a ram was entangled, providing that required sacrifice. That story has a happy ending. I remember the joy that I felt when I found my son in the park, and I can understand Adam's joy when God interceded. We are all finding new elements and new things to deal with in our lives. I don't know how much of this is because of the COVID virus, or how much would have just happened without it. But do know that change is always taking place, and managing that change is always easier with God. Abraham was a righteous but plain old man. True, God favored him, but he was a human being nonetheless. And you and I will probably not gain the wealth or the fame and recognition of Abraham, but that shouldn't stop us from trying to get to know God better. Because when hard times do hit, and they will, we have to rely on God. And life is much easier when we trust him in those times. To trust God, you've got to know God. When my son wandered away, I would say that I really didn't know God. And upon the realization of his being gone, I felt panic. I didn't even think of anybody else in the park helping out, since it was full of people. I felt so all alone in that moment of helplessness. Now, I feel that if I had had a better relationship with God, I believe I could have handled that situation much better. When things have not gone the way I would have liked, these days I find trusting God makes the disappointments and that anger so much easier to deal with. I do trust God. I believe he will provide me with what I really need in life. And when my time on earth will come to an end, I now trust that he will be with me through Jesus on the next leg of my journey. Having that reassurance won't necessarily change the final outcomes of those big events that we are going to face in the future. But trusting God, I know, will make handling them much more sane, without the panic and without the proverbial gnashing of teeth. Like the man on the radio said, you got to know God to trust God. I pray for you to have a relationship trusting with God when those unpleasant times pop up in your life. For remember this above all, God will provide.